Vladimir's wife, Evgenia Kara-Murza. Thank you so much for joining us and finding the time at what must be an incredibly challenging time for you. And my first question is just, how are you holding up?
Well, I don't have many choices, do I? Thank you very much for giving me this platform. I am holding up because I am married to an incredible man. I know that. He has my utmost respect and admiration, and I will fight for him for as long as it takes. I will fight for my kids' father, and I will make everything I can to bring him home to them.
When you heard the length of the sentence, 25 years, were you shocked and surprised, or had you consciously or subconsciously started to come to expect that it might be that severe?
No, actually, unfortunately, I was not surprised at all, because when asking for this absolutely mind-boggling sentence, a quarter of a century, the prosecutor in my husband's case said, and I quote, "This is our enemy who must be punished." Very Soviet-style wording, but it also made me realize, of course, it was obvious before, that the current Russian government sees Vladimir as its personal enemy for his long-time work on behalf of Russian civil society, for his campaigning for the introduction of targeted sanctions against human rights violators who stole in Russia but hid that money in the West, for all his long-time denouncing of the crimes committed by this regime with regard to its own population and with regard to our closest neighbors. For all of that, my husband is portrayed by the government, by the current Russian government, as a traitor. And this is why I realized that seen as an enemy of the state, seen as a personal enemy, he needs to be locked up for a quarter of a century to stop him from continuing his work.
And I wonder, however right or wrong that is, knowing as you do now how things have played out, do you wish he never did return to Russia? Or are you still, despite this extreme punishment, proud that he did?
Well, I don't think that this is the right question to ask, because he never left Russia. He refused to leave his country. He is a true Russian patriot. So had I asked him to give up his fights, I could not have done it. I know what my husband is fighting for. I know how important it is to him and to many Russians to see a different Russia. I know that he believes we deserve better. And I completely agree with him, and I share his conviction that this is possible. A different Russia is possible. It's just that we need to work to do everything we can to bring closer the day that this regime collapses and we get a chance at building that different Russia. Because for as long as there is an authoritarian or totalitarian regime in our country, Russia will continue being a threat to itself and its neighbors. So the only way for Russia to stop being a threat to everyone is for it to become a democracy. And in order for that to happen, first, Putin's vertical of power needs to collapse. So I cannot, I know what my husband is fighting for. And believe me, I'm terrified for his life. And I know that our kids are terrified for their father. But I understand what he's fighting for, and I will do everything I can to raise awareness about what is happening in Russia in the context of this war of aggression against Ukraine. I want to do everything I can to show the world that there is a very close connection between internal repression and external aggression. They go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. In order to continue warmongering, Vladimir Putin needs to stifle dissent, to completely eradicate all dissent within our country. And many people are in Russia are suffering from repression, from the extreme level of repression that is now being used against the Russian population.
And obviously, President Putin is quite successful at stymieing debate, at stopping critics from speaking out. I wonder how optimistic you are that your husband's cause, his fight, is working. Do you think his message is reaching the majority of Russians? Do you think that there is a swell of opinion that share his fight, your fight, or are you fearful that you're still early days in what will be a long battle?
When we talk about the Russian population, we are obviously talking about an unhealthy society. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that the last time the Russian population had access to free and independent, well, actually it was free but not fair election, according to international organizations. It was held in 2003. That's over 2 decades of stolen elections. Also, the last major independent TV channel readily available to the majority of the Russian population was closed down by the authorities in 2003 as well. So that's over 2 decades of propaganda. The Russian population does not have a single democratic instrument of voicing dissent. There is no freedom of speech, there is no freedom of association, no freedom of assembly, no free and fair elections. Every single right and freedom has been taken from the Russian population. So in this presence of total propaganda, it is extremely difficult to reach the majority of the population with independent news, as you might imagine. But at the same time, Russia placed second by the number of VPN services installed last year, second worldwide, which shows that there is a very high demand for independent and objective information, to access to independent and objective information. This is why it is so important to support the work of independent journalists working both inside and outside of Russia, creating this independent content for the Russian-speaking population. So I believe that it is not just, we're not talking about optimism here. We're talking about what we can do to bring closer the day when this regime collapses. And I believe that everyone who has an opportunity to do something should do it, whether it's spreading objective information, whether it's supporting the work of journalists, whether it's supporting the work of human rights activists, lawyers who represent those who are being oppressed in Russia, those who can call for more support to Ukraine, because Ukraine's victory in this war on Ukraine's terms is crucial. This will weaken the regime in the Kremlin, and this will, of course, bring closer the downfall of the regime. Everything has to be done now to weaken the regime and create conditions for the Russian population to realize that they can actually change something, and then we'll see mass protests in the streets of Russian cities.
I wonder, in light of that, if you'd mind me asking for your view about the Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, who's been arrested and denied bail pending trial just today. What's your view of that? What do you think Russia's motivation is of that? And do you think it's a warning sign to all foreign journalists in Russia? And should they take heed of what's happened to Gershkovich and potentially leave the country, or is it important that they stay?
Well, the arrest of Evan Gershkovich, of course, angered me a lot and saddened me at the same time. I understand that this is an attack against free press, against freedom of speech, absolutely. And you're absolutely right in saying that this is a signal to all those journalists who still remain in the country, who refuse to leave, like Vladimir refused to leave, because they believe it is their duty to stay and report from the grounds. And they're doing an extremely courageous work now. And I am truly very grateful to every single journalist who still remains in Russia and reports about the situation with the situation with human rights in Russia, reports from the ground. I am truly, I admire these people's courage, and I understand that after the blockade of all independent Russian media in the country, over 200,000 online media resources have been blocked since February 2022. All remaining Russian major independent media, TV Dost, Novaya Gazeta, and Echo of Moscow radio station have all been closed down by the authorities after the full-scale invasion had broken out. Access to social media platforms has been blocked as well. So the regime is doing everything to isolate the Russian population from any kind of independent information. They're doing everything from isolating the world from knowing what's happening in the country, because Vladimir Putin depends a lot on creating this warped imaging of reality for the world, that the Russian population, the entire Russian population, stands behind him and the war and supports his policies. In order to achieve that, he, of course, needs to stifle all independent media who say otherwise.
I wanted to come back, whether it's Evan, we're talking about it, or more importantly, with your point of view, your husband, to touch on something I know you've talked about before, but whether or not the US, I know you're US-based, the UK, your husband was a dual national, are doing enough in your eyes. And I guess I come at this with the perspective that clearly both countries are supporting Ukraine in a war against Russia, and that comes with its own significant political challenges domestically, as recent leaks, intelligence leaks have highlighted. Are you disappointed that they're not doing more, or can you understand the difficult balancing act that they face as governments?
I'm sure there is balancing, as there was this same balancing when Western leaders had to deal with the Soviet regime. And yet, thanks to the efforts, to personal advocacy of Western leaders, many Soviet dissidents were freed during the Soviet times. Andrei Sakharov was allowed to return from his exile in Gorky. Vladimir Bukovsky was released. Natan Sharansky was allowed to leave the country. Oleg Orlov, Ginsburg, and other Soviet dissidents were released thanks to the advocacy of Western leaders. So I believe that if it was possible during the Soviet times, it is definitely possible now. And also, I believe that the entire democratic community should stand with those people who risk their lives and their freedom to protect the same values on which the democratic societies are built.
Evgenia.
They are fighting for the same freedoms for their countries, and I believe that it would be very symbolically strong for the democratic countries, for the democratic community to stand with these people and fight for their release.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. We greatly appreciate it. We're right up against the top of the clock.